We turn now to our third presenter, Professor Chester A. Crocker, Professor of Strategic Studies at Georgetown, former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and a former Chairman of the Board of the United States Institute of Peace. Professor Crocker is one of the most respected voices in the nation on foreign policy, the subject he will be addressing. Professor Crocker.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Moore. I'm going to start by saying a few words about why it is that foreign policy is complicated to conduct these days. What is it about the international situation that makes it particularly difficult to conduct a coherent foreign policy? We all know we should have one. The question is, why is it so difficult? So I'm going to outline for you just a couple of the factors that make it difficult to conduct a coherent foreign policy. We are seeing an inevitable, in my view, diffusion of authority in the international system to various regions and other countries, not because America is declining, but because other countries are doing better. And so we are seeing a more diffused power structure in the international system. That, of course, has the effect of changing the normative climate in the international system. And we are seeing, I think, more and more evidence of the fact that there is a Western liberal international set of norms, and there's some other norms out there. Some of them are religious, some of them are basically old-fashioned statist norms in which there is the belief in places like Russia and China and elsewhere that state sovereignty is the #1 norm. So that issue of normative division in the international system is a very important question. So you have the combination of a power shift and a normative complexity, which makes it more difficult than it used to be to conduct a coherent foreign policy. We are seeing the regional order in different regions raised into question in a way that wasn't the case in the recent past. We're seeing parts of the world such as Eastern Europe, such as the Middle East, and parts of Africa where the actual existence of the territorial state system is in question and is being questioned. So that raises all kinds of questions for regional stability and raises the issue of what can America do about it? What should America do about it? Global order is declining. And that's a tricky situation to deal with because it creates vacuums, and vacuums can fester. Things fall between the cracks. In some cases we respond, in other cases we don't respond. Should we respond everywhere? We can't respond everywhere. So it's a complex set of environments that we're dealing with. Then I would point out the fact that I think it's extremely important that governments, including our own, are facing competition from many other actors in the international system. I'm talking about the role of non-governmental organizations, the role of international organizations, the role of global corporations. What I'm saying to you is an important part of the international system today is the decline of the government's own capacity to deal with problems vis-a-vis the initiatives, if you like, of non-governmental organizations, of advocacy groups, of ordinary citizens, and of criminal gangs and mafias. There's a lot of confusion, multiple actors in the international system today. And I guess a final factor just to add to the complexity of the environment facing a new administration in foreign policy is the fact that we have what I would call system overload. Previous speakers have noted the number of issues that are involved on our foreign policy agenda, and it's very complicated to try and figure out what that prioritization should be. What do we pay attention to? What do we not pay attention to? So I'm now going to proceed to outline some of the issues that I've just touched on and that other speakers have touched on in terms of raising for our candidates a series of questions of what they should be asked by the moderators of presidential debates, primary debates and general election debates. It seems to me, in light of what I've just said, that perhaps the #1 question is how to end the political dysfunction in Washington so that any administration of either party can conduct a coherent foreign policy. It is very difficult to solve the kind of problems that Admiral Blair has just talked about in terms of sequester in the military budget if you have dysfunction and you have political polarization and gridlock in Washington. So one might ask a candidate, what would you do, future president, to try and end the gridlock and the polarization as concerns our foreign policy agenda? How would you address that particular challenge? And then I guess the next question that's pretty basic to ask any future president is, how important is foreign policy in your agenda? I recall so clearly a press conference back in the 90s when then President Clinton was asked about the hideous scenario unfolding in the Balkans and Southeastern Europe. And the response was, in effect, I didn't get elected to do Bosnia. Well, that kind of approach, of course, changed with the pressure of events. And then I recall under former President George W. Bush, the lead up to the first months and weeks of his administration, it was clear that nation building was not on the agenda. And then 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden nation building is on the agenda. So the question, the most basic question you could ask a future president is, how important is foreign policy to you? How does it fit onto your national program? When you come to Washington, you may be able to accomplish 4 or 5 things in 4 years, or maybe 6 things in 8 years. Is foreign policy one of them? And if so, which part of foreign policy would you emphasize? Can we pick and choose? If we are to have an ambitious foreign policy and try and fix a lot of problems in East Asia, if we're going to pivot to Asia, if we're going to fix a lot of problems in the Middle East, how are we going to pay for it? And how much political capital do you really have to invest in your foreign policy? That's sort of the big question. Then moving on to more specific issues, we have the issue of revanchist Russia, the issue of Putin, and we all know that his foreign policy of sticking his finger in our eye. Vladimir Putin is a man who needs enemies, and he knows how to look for them, and that's what keeps him going. He needs external things to do to deflect attention from the problems that he's got at home. And he has a number of problems. I will not try to enumerate them all, but suffice it to say that he's caused trouble in Ukraine. He's causing trouble in some of the Baltic states. He's authorizing his armed forces to engage in what might be called provocative patrolling operations in the skies and in the waters around a number of NATO-related countries. So we have to ask ourselves, how far is this going? And now, of course, in Syria, he's really defined a brand new set of conditions for dealing with the Syrian problem. At the same time, it's pretty obvious, it seems to me, that we have some areas of common interest with Russia, and we have to figure out how do we balance that. There's lots of bad stuff in the US-Russian relationship. There also are some common interests. Are there things that we might be able to work on together? Are there things that we should be trying to work on together? Is it worthwhile trying to keep a channel open to this guy, even though he's in need of enemies? I watched a recent YouTube video that had Vladimir Putin scoring 7 goals against an undefended goal, and he was accompanied down the rink by members of the Russian hockey team. And you have to ask yourself, a guy who would do that on his birthday and then get it YouTube, you have to ask yourself what goes on here and how do you relate to someone like that. But are there any common interests? He is trying to shape a different environment politically and militarily in Syria. Is it because he thinks he can just reimpose Bashar al-Assad in power, or is he trying to set the table for an ultimate political outcome there, a negotiated outcome that might lead to a transition to a better Syria? If it's the latter, we should find out. So how do we find out? That's, I think, an important question. In the Middle East, we have a lot of burdens, and they've been touched upon by previous speakers, but it's a very long agenda. And the question is, can we cut back? Should we try to cut back our exposure in the Middle East and prioritize within the Middle East environment? Where do we focus? Can we focus on Libya, on Yemen, on Syria, on Iraq, on Iran, all these, to say nothing of Israel and the Palestinians? Given our own limited resources, should we be trying to encourage the emergence in the Middle East of an indigenous regional security structure that might provide the beginnings of greater stability in that region? Let me turn to China. China is another example of a situation where we have some bad news, and we also have some better news. And we have to figure out in our foreign policy toward China if we can walk and chew gum at the same time. What I mean by that is if we think about cyber attacks that the Chinese have been encouraging on our businesses and on our governmental institutions, if we think about their behavior in the South China Sea, if we think about their Great Silk Road initiatives where they're talking about one belt and what is it they call it, one belt and one road, going all the way from China across Central Asia and into Europe. The Chinese head of state was just in London and feted with red carpet treatment and riding to Buckingham Palace with the Queen. I mean, the Chinese are coming into Europe big time. So we have to ask ourselves, is that a problem? And if so, what exactly is the problem? At the same time as we have things that look like they are aggressive and expansionist in the Chinese behavior, the Chinese seem to be willing to talk to us about climate. Should we be doing what President Obama has been doing, which is to try and engage with the Chinese on areas where there are common interests? Obviously, trade and economic relations are of central importance to both countries. Climate's of central importance to both countries. But we also need to figure out how to deter the bad stuff. So it's really a question of balancing. So the question that I would ask the future president in this regard is, what do you think about China, Madam President-elect or Mr. President-elect? Is China a friend, a partner, a rival, an enemy? What terminology would you use to describe this important country? So I think there's quite a few issues of this kind that need to be given the most serious consideration and tough questions asked to our future candidates. What about immigration? What about this question which bedevils not only our country, but the countries of Europe today? And there are 60 million migrants in motion, moving around the world at any given time, a lot of them heading towards Europe, but also heading to other places. And we have our issues of debate and polarization about the issue of immigration policy in this country. So I guess the question I would ask there is, what policy toward immigrants do you believe is most consistent with American history? We are, after all, a nation of immigrants, American values, and American interests. It's not unlike the question that Angela Merkel, the German leader, and others around the world are having to ask themselves. So the immigration question belongs on the agenda. It's a tough question. It's caused a lot of informational overload in this country and a lot of debate. So we should definitely push that one. Another question relates to climate policy, and I think climate change issues are getting more and more attention internationally. There's a big conference coming up in November in Paris, and there's a couple of ways of looking at the way you should negotiate on the climate issue. You can look at it as a UN process with 192 countries participating. That's, by definition, a very complicated approach to try and make progress with 192 people at the table. Or you can do it at the G20 level, or you can do it at the US-China level. So what is the right approach? And in fact, do we have to do one or the other, or can we do multiple approaches to negotiating on climate issues? I think the main question for candidates in this area is this: do you believe it is important for the US to be a global leader in the field of climate policy? And if not, why not? If yes, what would you do? And how would you do it different from the current administration, the administration of Obama? Well, these are just a few issues. I'll close with a comment on the question of trade, because it's very interesting, in my view, that we have with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations, we have an example, a rare example perhaps, of what is possible when there is bipartisanship, when people can reach across the aisle and actually get something done, because this is a policy which united many Republicans and some Democrats, and so it's a question that we might put to candidate Hillary Clinton if she is indeed the nominee. and before she becomes a nominee, and it's certainly a question to put to the Republican nominee, whoever he or she turns out to be. Thank you very much for your attention.
Are there any questions for Professor Crocker?
One of our obvious problems is both political parties have moved further away from the middle. To get the nomination, the candidates have to take more extreme positions than they might otherwise take. In the process, we've lost Arthur Vandenberg's vision of politics stopping at the water's edge and both parties cooperating in this area. Now, instead of asking questions of candidates, let's pretend that you were hired as an advisor successively by each one of the candidates. What would you advise? What would be the most important thing for them to do to promote a strong, wise, successful U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think what you're asking me is how do you work across the aisle?
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, Robin...
And bring the country in the process behind you.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan had a way of doing it. It was called people skills. We haven't necessarily seen as much in the way of people skills in recent years as we might. He reached across the aisle to Tip O'Neill, and they were able to solve some problems that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. Maybe
They liked each other.
they liked each other. They had a basis for communication. Maybe what we're talking about is more offering of seats on Air Force One. Maybe it's evenings, evenings at the White House. It's personal rapport. It's personal chemistry. And it's finding people you can operate with who are willing to join with you and saying publicly once you're in office, you know what, I know that the American people would like to see us get something done here. It's not just about having a food fight all the time. The problem, it's the one you raise, is how do you get there through the primaries? Other questions? Sir.
Could you talk a little bit about challenges the next president will face in the Western Hemisphere? Whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, issues with Mexico, there's been decisions taken on Mexico related to human rights. We have a new government in Canada.
No, it's a good question, and we do have a different government emerging in Canada, which is going to definitely have some impact on our options and on our potential allies in the region. Clearly, there's going to be a question for the next administration on how to follow what President Obama has begun in terms of the Cuban relationship, how to make it reciprocal, because so far we've been making a number of gestures and we haven't been seeing much coming back, and it's essential that we see the Cuban regime move forward in terms of bilateral relations with us, but also in terms of domestic performance on all the issues within its own country. I mean, the real debate there, I guess, is over the issue of whether we want to see a soft landing for that regime in Cuba, and do we want to facilitate that? Another major issue in the hemisphere that I have been tracking closely is the question of the peace process in Colombia. It's not on the front page, but Colombia is a very important country for both reasons of narcotics policy and because it's the only country in the entire hemisphere that's been at war on and off for the last 50, 60 years. There is a fragile peace process underway, and what can we do to support that? So that would be on my list. And then I guess the final one I'd mention is the chaos in too many Central American countries. It's really a problem of policing and a problem of migration policy and weak governance. Can we be doing more in that area? Because it's having an impact across our southern border. Admiral Black?
Ambassador Crocker, the first question you asked was where would foreign policy rank on the list of priorities of a new candidate. But what are the most powerful reasons that it ought to rank high, or that as was once famously said, you don't find foreign policy, it finds you once you're elected. But I mean, what are the reasons that we just can't downgrade it, pretend that we can deal with domestic issues?
It's a very good question, but I think the answers are clear. First of all, most countries around the world look to see what we are going to do or not do. And when we decide not to do something, that's actually a decision. It's an action. It has an impact. So inaction you can't pretend that you don't need to have a policy on things when you are the strongest country in the world, because when you don't have a policy, it creates an opening or a vacuum or just an atmosphere of uncertainty, and people don't know where things are headed. And when people don't know where things are headed, the obvious instinct for people with guns all over the world, and I'm talking about rebel movements as well as governments, is to stick their finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing. And that's a dangerous time. So that's the reason why we have to have foreign policy and have to have one that's coherent. Another reason is that, as I mentioned in my remarks, boundaries are being put into question in far too many parts of the world. And a world where boundaries are in question is a very dangerous world. We've seen that in our own history, and we've got to avoid that happening. I guess the final reason is that we Americans, and I'm sure Vladimir Putin is watching as I say this, we Americans do think of ourselves in some respects as an exceptional place that has something to offer the world in terms of leadership. So the American people expect that, and so does Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Ambassador Crocker, thank you for a superb presentation on foreign policy.